Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to ULAB on this afternoon for a very auspicious occasion for the historical community and also for us in the eastern part of what is Bengal. I would just like to welcome up here Imran Rahman from the Special Advisor to the Board of Trustees to welcome our very special guest, Dr. Tariq Omar Ali.
Thank you, and very warm welcome and a good afternoon to all present. It's really my pleasure to welcome Dr. Tariq Omar Ali. I have a difficulty remembering his name since I know him as Rene all my life. But welcome, Tariq, to ULAB. And welcome to all the guests who are here, and of course, our own faculty and students. This is going to be a treat for you all, because Tariq is going to speak about his book, which is entitled Local History of Global Capital, Jute and Peasant Life in Bengal Delta. Just a brief introduction to Tariq. Tariq is currently an assistant professor of history at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, a very renowned university. Tariq did his PhD from Harvard, PhD in history, and also an MA in history. He did his MPhil in historical studies from Cambridge, and he did his BA in history from Grinnell, which is a very famous liberal arts college in USA. Um, he has received quite a few fellowships and awards, including the Campus Research Board from Illinois, the Junior Research Fellow again from Illinois, the Arnold Beckham Research Award from Illinois, the Sardar Patel Award for Best Dissertation on South Asia at a US university in 2012, and the Harvard Yenching Fellowship for his PhD studies. He has lectured in several prestigious places like Harvard, Yale, and University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, in Tufts, in University of Iowa, etc. He teaches courses such as History of South Asia, Commodities, Capital and Empire, Peasants and Politics in South Asia, Reading Subaltern Studies, Introduction to Historical Methods, etc. So one of our brightest and best young historians, and we are very privileged to have him speak about his book, the first university, I believe you're doing that in Bangladesh. Good, thank you. We will get a lot of mileage out of that. And I'd like to also welcome many of my friends. His parents are my dearest friends, Bashirul Haq and Firdaus Azim. Thank you very much. And his aunt, Dr. Tasneem Azim. We are also expecting his younger aunt, Safia Azim, and Faisal Siddiqui. So welcome. I hope you have a very, very interesting and enjoyable time. And I think you will probably get a chance to interact with Tariq later on. Thank you very much. So big hand for Tariq, please.
Wait for people to settle down. Thank you very much. Thank you for those introductions. Thank you everyone for being here through the rain and the traffic. And this is indeed my first event around the book anywhere in the world. This is the first event at all. And I'm excited and a little bit nervous because it just came out about 2 months ago, but it went out of my hands about a year ago when it went off to copy editors and so forth. And I've tried very hard to forget it for the last year. So I've had to spend this morning trying to remember what my book's about and come up with about a half an hour where I can tell you a little bit about it. So I'm going to try and do it in as short a time as I can, just introduce you to this audience of the book. So I'm looking forward to Dr. Samia Khatun's stinging critique of it, which will be following this. And I just want to take about 20 minutes maybe to lay out what the book is about, to introduce this audience to the book. So let me just begin. Jute fibers used to connect the Bengal peasantry in this region to a global marketplace. It entangled them in global circuits of commodities and capital, and it subjected them to the rhythms and vicissitudes of global commodity prices. The primary question posed by my book is this: what happened to this mostly Muslim Bengali peasant community once their lives became so thoroughly enmeshed in global capital? What happens to a group of people when their entire existence, when their well-being, when their survival, when their prosperity is dependent on terms of trade, exchanges of prices set in very distant places? So I examined this question of how entanglements in global capital reshaped the material and intellectual lives of jute cultivating peasantry over 100 years, beginning in the mid-19th century when jute first became a global commodity, and ending in the mid-20th century in the immediate aftermath of partition and Pakistan. So at one hand, this book is really sort of an attempt to tell the history of this region of Bangladesh through the fiber jute. And I think this is important. The book is also an attempt to retell the history of global capital, not just the history of this region, but the history of the world. Because this is what happened with jute in this region is really part of a very, very large story that involves not just Bengal, but also West Africa, other parts of South Asia, Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and so forth. It is about the making of global capitalism during the 19th and 20th centuries, when, under the twinned impetus of European empire and European capital, peasant communities in Europe's colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean produced ever increasing quantities of cotton, sugar, cocoa, peanuts, palm oil, hemp, rubber, and rice to feed and fuel European industry. Just a few statistics to drive the point home. Between 1850 and 1910, the number of acres of land planted with jute in Bengal increased from 50,000 to just under 4 million, an 80-fold increase. In that same period, Senegalese peanut production increased from just 5 metric tons to 95,000 metric tons. Ghanaian cocoa production increased from 95 pounds to about 100,000 tons. Manila hemp production in the Philippines went from 18,000 to 160,000 tons. The acreage of Burmese rice increased from 700,000 to 5 million acres. And peasants in Malaya planted about 1 million acres of rubber trees. Global capital was made by peasants. Global capital was made by peasants in colonized regions of Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. And I think this is something we often forget. Historians of global capital tend to see peasant production as essentially pre-capitalist, as remnants of a feudal system destined to disappear with the inexorable advance of capitalism. So my book, rather at its broadest level, is an attempt to reinsert the peasantry into histories of capital and to narrate the history of global capital from the perspective of the peasantry, particularly in colonized regions. So I want to take I'll try and do it as quickly as I can, just sort of give you a brief, broad outline of the time period and sort of the major arguments that are made in the book. Let me begin by talking about the economics of jute cultivation. The expansion of jute cultivation in the 19th century was not spurred, say, unlike indigo in this very same region, by violence. It wasn't the colonial state didn't come in and force people to start growing jute, nor did they actually come in and encourage people to start growing jute. It was a function of prices set in distant markets. If you look at the expansion of jute over those 50 years, it took place in spurts. Every time prices went up in Europe, acreage would increase rather sharply. Firstly, in the 1860s, a very rapid increase in acreage, then in the 1880s, and then in the 1900s. And jute cultivation reached its historic high in about 1909 during a boom in jute prices. The expansion of jute, however, came at the expense of rice. Fiber and grain competed for peasant land and labor. To grow jute was to forego the production of rice. But this was okay as long as most farmers in the Bengal Delta had enough land to grow rice for household subsistence and then jute for commercial sale. But the expansion in 1900 would change things rather dramatically. At that point, during that period, farmers stopped growing enough rice to feed their households. Rather, they would grow jute and buy rice from the profits they made from the sales. They would make up the shortfall in subsistence from that, from their proceeds of their jute sales. And that led to expose them to hunger. This was okay as long as the terms of trade between jute and rice were good. As long as the price of jute was high enough for you to be able to buy enough rice. But it meant when jute prices fell, as they always do, we're talking about global capital, boom and bust, prices going up, prices collapsing. But when they fell, they exposed peasants to hunger. And 1914, when jute prices fell rather abruptly, so 1914, the war breaks out in August 1914. And this is just as farmers are bringing jute into the market. The jute market disappears. And this is the first instance, this to me in my thesis, in my book, is the beginning of peasant impoverishment in the Bengal Delta. This is the moment when, from then onwards, we see a steady slide into immiseration, a steady process of immiseration, a steady slide into deep poverty. Poverty was driven by many things. It was driven by unfavorable terms of trade between jute and consumer goods. It was driven by fragmenting smaller and smaller landholdings. It was driven by a deteriorating ecology, which meant more frequent and more severe floods and more waterborne diseases. It was exacerbated by indebtedness. More and more peasants took on emergency loans to tide them over, to overcome periods of extreme risk, extreme vulnerability. And it really deepened during the Great Depression, when very, very low jute prices meant that most peasants sold off all of their assets. And in 1943 and 1942 and 1943, when rice prices rose very sharply and jute prices did not rise as much, it led to great hunger. It led to the Great Bengal Famine, where between 2 and 3 million people died of starvation, most of them in East Bengal's jute tracts. So this is sort of the broad history of jute's economy during the colonial period, a late 19th century period of relative prosperity when jute brings in cash earnings and their household subsistence is not compromised, and an early 20th century of scarcity, of risk, of vulnerability, of hunger, of starvation, and of death. So the early 20th century period, the late 19th century period, right up to World War I, was a period of relative prosperity. And this prosperity in the Bengal's jute tracts marked itself, revealed itself in jute cultivators' material possessions. And this, to me, is one of the most important, I think, points I make in the book, which is I focus on peasant consumerism. And the peasants are always seen as producers, as people who produce rice, we never think of them as buyers. We never think of them as people who consume goods. And the argument I make here is that we should not see the expansion of jute cultivation as merely a sort of a peasant response to the incentive of price. It's not the cold calculus of profits and prices. Rather, it is about the hot desire for consumer goods and new kinds of consumer goods that have become available for the first time in rural huts and bazaars and melas. There's lots of anecdotal and sort of numerical evidence that shows that peasants were consuming Manchester cloths, corrugated iron roofs, umbrellas, kerosene oil and lamps, safety matches to light those kerosene oil, cigarettes, metal utensils, silver and gold ornaments, umbrellas, children's toys, legal services, educational facilities. These are new goods that were not available at any point before in rural huts and bazaars, and suddenly we see them available, and the way to buy them is to grow jute, to earn cash to buy them, and they're buying more and more of them. There are 2 points I want to make, and I do make, about peasant consumption. First, that the consumption of these commodities did not lead peasant men and women to adopt forms of dress, of living, of domesticity, of dining, of sociality that we would think as modern. In other parts of the world, in urban areas, new forms of clothes, new forms of homes, new form of construction materials meant there were changes in people's livings that made them recognizably modern. Not so with the peasantry. Peasant men still wore lungis and gamchas. They did not start wearing trousers and shirts, unlike urban men. Peasant women did not start wearing blouses and petticoats, unlike urban women. Peasant families did not start sitting on dining tables upright and eating off of tables, unlike urban families. In spite of corrugated iron replacing thatch on peasant roofs, peasant home remained single-room, multi-purpose structures constructed around a central courtyard rather than multi-room constructions with specialized spaces for different activities, different room for dining, different room for sleeping, and so forth. All of this meant that for colonial observers, for colonial officials, for urban podrolok who saw the peasant, they did not see them as modern. And they saw there was a paradox in the way in which peasants were viewed. They were both prosperous and backward, because their prosperity had not resulted in what other people recognized as modern. The second point I want to make is that consumption was hugely significant to peasant households themselves. The various forms of consumption that they were doing was politically significant. What I do in my book is I reinterpret the Swadeshi movement and the Swadeshi clashes between peasants and activists. So just to give you a little bit of background, the Swadeshi movement in 1905 was one of the first organized nationalist movements. And it entered the rural countryside as an attempt by activists to forcibly prevent the consumption of imported consumer goods. They would go into huts and bazaars in rural areas and prevent vendors from selling cloth, from selling imported salt, from selling various kinds of consumer goods. And in the course of this, you would have various moments when the activists and peasants would clash. There would be violent clashes. What I do in my book is I say, and most historians have seen these clashes as Hindu-Muslim. They're Hindu-Muslim violence, and that's how it's been interpreted through much of history. What I do in my book is I say, no, actually, we should not see this as Hindu-Muslim clashes. We should see these clashes as attempts by peasants to protect the practices of consumption, to protect their market-based livelihoods, to continue to enjoy the pleasures of consumption in marketplaces against an attack by nationalist activists that are attempting to prevent that. So one of my cases is a clash that took place in the Nangalban Mela outside Narayanganj. And the clash begins when Swadeshi activists enter the Mela and they force one boy who had bought a German-made looking glass to return it, and they force another boy who had bought a small box which said "Made in Germany" on top of it to return it. And the people got so upset that they attacked the Swadeshi activists. And I read that event and other similar events to say what is happening here is not just Hindus and Muslims going at each other. It is a place where consumption is pleasurable, and someone's trying to stop that pleasure of consumption in an attempt to protect those practices of consumption. So these pleasurable forms of consumption, of course, all end with World War I. We enter the period of immiseration after World War I, and consumption becomes a much more stressful activity. Marketplaces are no longer sources, places where you can have fun. They're stressful places where you're struggling to secure basic subsistence. And this is, I'm going to move to another point I make in my book here, where I move forward to the 1930s and I say, instead of this politics of pleasurable consumption, we get new discourses which promote, amongst peasants, which promote austerity, which promote hard work, which encourage cutting down on consumption, which criticize consumption as frivolous, and which relates all of it to Islam. So my book examines how the consumption and pleasures of consumption give way to new discourses, criticizing consumption as frivolous and wasteful, and emphasizing careful household budgeting, austerity, hard work, and even patriarchal authority over women and children as a means of balancing household budgets. Moreover, these practices are construed as Islamic. This discourse of being austere circulates in the form of texts. These are little pamphlets that are published in small town printing presses in Kishorganj, in Pabna, in Tangail, which are puthis. They're puthis that have been printed out. And they're these long poems, and they're oftentimes the text itself is adorned with Islamic symbols. You have a crescent moon and star on it. You'll have an Arabic word in the title. Some of them open from the right, like an Arabic book. And I argue in the book that these texts constitute an agrarian form of Islam, a new thinking of what Islam should be in a peasant community at a time of immiseration and poverty. The poems often begin with a few lines decrying Muslim peasant poverty. Musulman gone aaj dekhiya hai hai bukta jai fatia. Poets critique frivolous consumption. Behuda khoroj jeba korilo shaytaner bhai shei hoilo. And they relentlessly mock peasants for their consumption. And they're particularly mocking of something called an Albert cut. An Albert cut was apparently a fashionable hairstyle in the 1920s, named for Prince Albert, consort and husband of Queen Victoria. So the poem goes, Mathay Albert rakha kemon baka malir chat, Albert toile dite dite toilor pollo bat, deshe napiter kache, deshe napiter kache nahi boshe ar, shohre dui ana diye chhatai bahar. The poems actually are, and I read this in my book, as a program of Muslim emancipation. They call it mukti. How do we liberate Muslims from poverty? How do we emancipate Muslims from their economic conditions? This program for emancipation is perhaps made most explicit in a pamphlet by a man called Abdul Hai, written by a man called Abdul Hai, called Adorsha Krishak, which was published in Mymensingh in 1921. Adorsha Krishak included a 21-point program for mukti. The first point was, every peasant will keep accounts of revenue and expenditure and will completely desist from all wasteful expenditure. And then it went on. Farmers should keep enough land to grow rice for subsistence. They should plant cotton, sugarcane, date palms, betel vines, and tobacco. They should not visit markets empty handed, but with goods to sell. They should avoid litigation. They should not buy fish, but catch their own fish. They should not smoke tobacco or chew betel leaf or chew pan unless they've grown it themselves. They should make their own umbrellas instead of buying umbrellas, so forth, so forth. Islam in 1920s and 30s Bengal became, oddly enough, a program of austerity, a religion of austerity. It was about buying less, working hard to produce your own goods instead of buying it from markets, not spending too much. I haven't given those courses. Also about disciplining your women and children harshly instead of rewarding them by buying them goods. And it was this very kind of austere, very harsh idea of austerity, which informed this new practice of Islam. I want to conclude with just by making one of the other big themes of the book, which is about spaces of capital, and how Jute sort of makes the geography, the spatial landscape of the region as we know it. One of the interesting things about these pamphlets, of course, is they're all published in these small towns, right? They're all published in Mufassal small town printing presses. And I think you can trace the growth of the printing press, the Mufassal print culture, Mufassal print economy from Jute. And particularly the relationship that Jute carved out, wrought between hinterland farms, small towns where jute was collected, processed, baled, assorted, and Calcutta. So what I do in my book is I show how peasant-produced jute moves through the deltas, riverways, and railways to Calcutta's warehouses, docks, and mills, and how along the way the fiber is bulked, assorted, and packaged into standardized bales. And then I show how in these towns where these activities take place, these towns grow very rapidly. These towns grow very, very rapidly during the late 19th century as merchants move in. And as is the always case in the British Empire, state follows very closely on the heels of capital. So merchants are immediately followed by officials, various kinds of government services, and so forth. By these towns, the big jute towns, are Narayanganj, Shirajganj, and Jadpur. But all other jute towns, which are very important jute centers, include Akhaura, Brahmanbaria, Kishorganj, Tangail, Jamalpur, Madaripur, Faridpur, Bogra, Pabna, Nilphamari, Domar. All the little towns that we know today are very much connected to the jute trade. During the late 19th century, these towns are very much were largely Hindu, mostly Marwari merchants and Bengali Hindu salaried professionals. And they would appear as little sort of islands of Hindu-dominated spaces surrounded by, in a sea of mostly Muslim peasantry. And Swadeshi conflicts really brought that sort of dynamic to the fore. During clashes at the John Mashtami Mela in Jamalpur, there was actually episodes of Muslim peasants laying siege to Jamalpur town, surrounding it. And they've got this real sort of town-country dynamic going there. The composition of these towns began to change after World War I, or even earlier than that, in the 1900s, when Muslim peasants began to invest jute money in sons' education or in setting up businesses in Mufassal towns. These mostly Hindu towns by the 1930s had become half and half, largely, half Hindu and half Muslim. And these newly created new class of mostly Muslim professionals, Muslim businessmen who are moving into Mufassal towns with close roots to the countryside, formed the sort of they were the ones who were establishing printing presses, authoring poems and pamphlets, financing the printing of poems and pamphlets. They were this Mufassal Muslim middle class of businessmen, salaried men, constituted the circles of authorship, patronage, and readership that produced and consumed agrarian Islamic texts. Those printed poems that were coming out of this new group that had come out and emerged in the 1920s and 1930s. My book places, especially in the latter half of my book, I place a strong emphasis on this newly created Mufassal Muslim middle class with roots and strong connections to rural hinterland. And I talk about how they sort of transformed the processes of formal electoral politics in the Bengal Delta during the last decades of British Empire, and then played crucial roles in the Pakistan movement during the closing years of British rule. My book ends in the immediate aftermath of partition and with the creation of East Pakistan. And what I'm really focused on in that chapter is partition. If you think about it, partition effectively carved out the Jute lands, took it away from Calcutta, and made it its own country. It created in East Pakistan that was a hinterland without a metropolis. There was no industry, no large cities, nothing. For the post-colonial state of Pakistan, the immediate concern was to generate revenue from fiber, to earn taxes and foreign exchange from exports of jute. The problem for the Pakistani state, however, was that most jute just went across the border, across partition lines to the other side. In my book, I show how jute was the first commodity to be policed across partition lines, the first commodity to be regulated. The first attempts to stop things moving across the border was not people, but fiber, in the Pakistan government's attempt to capture it and generate revenue. And I show how the Pakistani government's attempts to really make fiber, to police fiber, led to more and more ridiculous, more and more violent interventions in the borderlands, culminating in 1952 when the government called in the military to prevent smuggling on the border, gave it shoot to kill orders. If they catch someone smuggling, they could just shoot them, and in typical military fashion called it Operation Closed Door. And the book ends there, but let me just read from the conclusion to say where it really ends. It ends chronologically at that point. Sorry, I'll just be quick. So this is from the conclusion, which is really, really rather brief. While conducting archival research in Bangladesh, I was often asked by friends and family members whether my research would help in reviving the jute industry, if I would bring jute back. This desire to bring jute back is an oft-repeated slogan for politicians, academics, policymakers, and newspaper editorialists in Bangladesh. Newspapers run editorials headline, "Revival of Golden Fiber," or "Lost Glory of Jute Needs to be Revived." And the Bangladeshi state sponsors initiatives promoting jute handicrafts, and decoding the jute genome, and policies mandating the use of jute bags for packaging. To return to this question that was posed to me repeatedly, no, this book is not intended to help revive the jute industry. Instead, my ambition is to provide a language to describe local histories of global capital as they exist, not as they're imagined by nationalist projects. To the new jute nostalgists of contemporary Bangladesh, I would suggest a deeper engagement with the economic lives of today, with the economic lives of garment workers and overseas laborers who constitute today's contemporary Bangladesh's local history of global capital. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tariq, for such a wonderful introduction to what I'm sure is going to be a book that's going to transform the landscape of how the peasant is written about in this part of Bengal, in so much as it's actually one of the first books I've read that's really, really, really put it into contact with some of these world history debates that have been happening. So just to give you a brief explanation of what we're going to do now is when I first read this book about 6 months ago now, it was shortly after I first met Tariq, and I really deeply enjoyed it, but I found myself arguing with it, disagreeing with it. And this is what historians do. If you are disagreeing with someone's book, it means you're actually often paying them the biggest compliment that you can, because you're taking their arguments seriously. So I actually wrote him a 13-page document going, this is what I think. and it was the beginning of some very exciting conversations between us that have continued. So what I want to do is actually pick up some of that conversation that we've been having. Hopefully, in my response, you will get a sense of where the book fits in sort of larger debates about how to tell history and the different ways of telling history. We've put 2 seats up here, so if I could invite Tariq to come up. Is there... Okay, so firstly, my biggest congratulations on getting this book out there. I cannot actually overstate how big a deal it is for a book like this to come, which has been produced thinking from Bangladesh and thinking about East Bengal. The hegemony of Indian production about Bengal is really, really, really felt. When I read this book, it was like breathing a sigh of relief, because here was Bangladesh, here was towns I knew, here was people you could actually recognize. So congratulations, that's just a wonderful event for us in South Asian historiography and British imperial historiography. Okay, so what I understood your project to be was to it takes from Sven Beckert's focus on the power and agency of empires in the field of global history. And you say, Sven Beckert gives us this wonderful concept of the global countryside, and you give us eyes to be able to see Bengal in the context of part of the global countryside. So Bengal and jute become part of a larger history of peanuts and Senegal and various other commodities that completely shape global countrysides everywhere. And I felt that you also, with this book, give us new eyes with which to see and reconsider the peasant. You're, as I understand it, doing a pushback against this idea that the peasant is a rustic, backward figure. The peasant is always the rustic, right? And you're arguing, no, look, the peasant is actually a deeply modern figure in this way. So you're giving us these new ways of looking at our own history, our own past, our own proto-selves, in a sense, right? So as I was sort of traversing the jute tracts and the vibrant hearts and then the rivers laden with golden fiber that you transport your readers to, was very much swept along in your narrative of temporal change. You have a particular gift of being able to show us a very large pattern and then suddenly zoom in to something that's quite exquisite and detailed. But as I was going along with this, I increasingly got very, very, very uncomfortable with some of the limitations of the ways of seeing that you were inducting your audience into. And the realization dawned on me that you're a macro historian and I'm a micro historian. So what Tariq does is he takes these statistical tables, these bales of jute, and he can turn it into a story that's interesting. I look at, tables of bales of jute and I cannot make sense of them. What I would do is I would start from the small. I would go to one tiny little poem or one tiny little thing, and then I would work outwards and get a bigger picture. He goes in the other direction. He starts from the big and goes in. So in many ways, the conversations we've been having are about the different ways you can actually come to the same topic. So I would describe Tariq as someone who belongs to global history or world history as an approach to how you tell the past. And I would describe myself as someone who belongs to what's called history from below. Okay, so it starts as history of colonized peoples in the Caribbean uprising, and then it's the history of workers, and then it's the history of women, it's the history of people who are usually left out of historical narratives. So from history from below, of course, the peasant is a very, very, very important character, someone who you really want to think about. And also for Tariq's project, the peasant is a character that's very important. So I hope that that prefaces what I'm about to say next. Okay, so very much my favorite part of the book was your chapter on consumption, on peasant consumption. These brilliant little insights on how particularly the German mirror that the little peasant boy takes home, and the mob tries to take it away from him, but he wins and he takes it home. So part of your story of claiming that peasants are modern is very much that consumption makes them modern. Consumption is something through which they become modern. What I wanted to ask of you is, how is this kind of buying any different to buying under other systems? Of course, at this time, they are all under British common law. So it's property relations under British common law as we understand it. But consumption particularly colonial court procedures. They're buying the right to go to court and be litigious, right? So suddenly I was recognizing mamlabaji. That word mamlabaji is coming from this particular thing that he's describing. There's lots of people going to court all the time, because you didn't actually look at whether or not these people's grandfathers or great grandfathers actually left a trace in South Asian legal systems, I was kind of unconvinced that actually they were any more mamlabaji than in the generations that preceded. And so I guess I wanted to know more of a sense of how the kind of property relations and the consumption that you were talking about actually grafted onto indigenous senses of consumption or practices or idea philosophies of consumption, whether or not you thought also whether or not you thought, or why you thought it was so important to argue that they are modern. So this actually gets to the very heart of your project in a sense. You've said that overall the historiography has made these people into rustics, and you want to insist they're modern. But only if they are modern are they human? Is the question I want to pose to you. Why do you want to rescue them from non-modernity? Are not non-modern peoples also human? Now, I'm aware we're running out of time. Sure, of course. Okay, go ahead, please.
This is um, no, thanks. That was so like no, that was great, and I think that's a very nice way of thinking about macro. Because I think all historians, the skill of history is to be able to situate, is to be able to relate the big and the small. I think that's how history works, right? You kind of have sweeping narratives, and you have people, and you have to be able to move between these two scales. And I think you phrased very nicely how we move perhaps very differently, but the modern. So I think I come at the modern from two ways. One is an idea that modernity is something that is fashioned by people, by individuals themselves through material objects, right? So the watch is a modern thing. The pocket is a modern thing. Wearing a pair of trousers with a pocket is a part of becoming modern. And the ways, in the case of South Asian history, and especially women's history, like the role of the blouse and the petticoat as allowing women's mobility, creating a modern woman, a modern urban woman. It's a very kind of established historiography of how I think material objects and their uses in bodily fashions, in your home, in the domestic spaces. And this is coming very much from, I guess, Dipesh Chakraborty's habitations of modernity, right? This is the ways in which people craft modern lives for themselves. I think what I found, and I wasn't expecting to find this, is that peasants are consuming the very same articles. They're consuming cloth, they're consuming, they're consuming the very articles that are supposedly making colonial urban people modern are being consumed by peasants as well. And how do I then, but then of course what I then found was they're consuming these articles, but they're not changing their lives in the ways you'd expect them to. They're not suddenly, they're buying Manchester cloth, but they're not wearing pants with pockets in it. Instead, they're having more changes of lungi, like cleaner lungis, or more changes of sari, cleaner saris. They're buying modern forms of illumination as well. They're buying kerosene lamps and oil, but they're not perhaps doing the kinds of activities you'd associate, the kinds of evening entertainment, adda sessions you'd expect with modernity. So does that mean that they're not modern, or does it mean we can craft alternative modernities from the same material objects? And I fell on the argument of this an alternative modernity they're crafting from the same material objects, which is even, I think, which makes it very interesting is that we refuse to recognize them as modern even then. Even then, for everyone looking at it, the peasant was a quintessential backward object because he's not doing these things we expect people to do as they buy objects, as they make money, etc., etc. I think recognizing the kinds of lives that peasant men and women crafted from the objects they're buying then as a form of modernity, being made with the same objects, the same, was kind of important to me at least as a move. And I guess the second question was about, and I think I should lay out this argument I have about property rights. In 1872, in Pabna, a farmer took his landlord to court because the landlord, the zamindar, tried to enhance rent and won. And he won under the 1859 Act 10 of the Tenancy Act. And because he won, a movement spread throughout the Bengal Delta of farmers forming leagues to take zamindars to court every time zamindars tried to enhance rents. And between 672 and 1885, when the British finally reformed the land law, which prevented this sort of which gave farmers automatically the rights they were trying to win by court suits, we got hundreds and hundreds of court suits, which were part of a broad anti-rent movement. What I did, and this is maybe a little cheeky and a little cute in terms of the argument, but what I did was I said that what farmers were doing, they were using jute profits to sue their landlords. They were using jute profits to outlast their zamindars in courtrooms. Zamindars ran out of money and couldn't continue contesting lawsuits before peasants did. This is huge. And what I said was I called this the use of jute money to finance lawsuits against zamindars to obtain property rights, to obtain more secure property rights. I called it a form of consumption. I said this is a form of actually using money to buy property rights. And I strengthened my argument, I thought, by saying, one of the things the British did was they moved the local place they used to adjudicate rent suits in the revenue office. They moved it to the district court. I said the district court becomes a vendor of property rights, where if you can go and contest a lawsuit for any length of time, you can gain the security of that. So this was kind of the move. The move for me there was perhaps not so much a question of modernity and modern forms of property rights, but it was a question of recasting property rights as consumer. Property rights is no longer gained by going to the state or going to a legal body and arguing for it, but being able to actually pay and outlast your zamindar in a lawsuit. And that's what won it. So that was kind of that was the move there with property rights rather than that.
Okay, so I'm conscious that our audience must want to ask our speaker questions, so I'm just going to make one more comment and then hand over to you guys. Now, it was absolutely delightful recognizing in your pages sort of proto-versions of many men I know in Bangladesh and its diaspora. But by the end of chapter 4, it was very obvious that I would meet very few such women in your book. So it made me aware of a very peculiar kind of feminist reading strategy that I've begun to employ when I read South Asian history, where you're straining to look for women. And it's actually a form of reading that exercises the same kind of eye muscles that you have to use if you're trying to find non-white people between the lines of, say, Australian historiography, right? It's the very same act of reading between the lines. Where are they? Where are the missing people? Where are the missing people? So, despite setting up, quote, the initiative and creativity of the peasant household, end quote, as the focus of your analysis, the figure you actually write about is the land-owning peasant male and his activities largely beyond the household. Now, while he might be headed home with goods during good times, and he purchases global products in the marketplace or is litigating in the courtroom, you never actually follow him into the home. Women appear every now and again in your chapters as household labour who risk hunger at difficult times, and they die in great numbers at the time of the Bengal famine, as you write. Now, if you're going to write a history of men from peasant households, why not explicitly declare it and theorise it? Otherwise, you risk reinventing strategies of not seeing women that collapse the household into the male for yet another generation of audiences. So, as I said, I was excited about the kind of eyes you're giving us to see with. These were the parts of the eyes I was like, oh, what's he doing? Why is he doing this? So let me reiterate that in no way am I saying that there shouldn't be histories of male landowning peasants or their creative fashioning of modern masculinities, but I propose to you that a new generation of historians like you, who clearly have a commitment to futures of gender equality, cannot continue to write histories of men only without interrogating the role that history writing has in continuing to perpetuate these ways of seeing.
I agree. Guilty as charged. Um, no, but I think no, but let me. I mean, I'll like. I mean, I'm not going. I'm going to say the paths not taken in the book where I wish I could go back and rewrite and take those paths is exactly, I think, what you're saying about making this more explicitly a book about the making of a peasant masculinity. And there were several openings for me to do so. I think one of them was the agrarian Islamic poems, where you do get very explicit ideas of what it means to be the patriarch. They are written to the male, and they're very kind of, and then they're very, you get very explicit ideas of why women need to be controlled. Because if women aren't, I mean, like, I mean, I don't remember them perfectly, but one of the long poems is a story of two brothers who fall out because their two wives fight about who got the larger share of meat. And in that story, in this poem, we get both a critique of why are they buying meat and not raising their own chickens, and why are they buying meat for their women? They should be buying meat and telling their women to cook it. So like there's this sort of there's this poems are shot through with patriarchal control, and I mean, and I don't take that to the next place, right? I just point it out and say these discussions of patriarchal control keep coming back to the marketplace. They keep coming back to ways of reducing. They're about reducing expenditure, but I do think that that's only one of several places where I had openings. I had openings in my archives to say things about how peasant patriarchal authority, the idea of peasant patriarch, and the importance of, in the various discursive forms of the peasant patriarch maintaining patriarchal control is really, really strong. And I think there was ways in which I could have run that through the whole narrative from beginning to end.
So I think I would like to continue discussions later about whether your approach, whether it's actually endemic to global history or world history, the kinds of things that aren't being seen or questioned. We will continue that discussion later, but I just wanted to close off what I have to say by saying that kind of like the little peasant boy who ran home with the German mirror and learned how to see himself and see the world perhaps in new ways. I felt a little bit like that about your book. I took it home. I came back to Bangladesh at a time when I was reading it. So it was a very, very, very it was a re-entry text. I was reading a Bangladeshi history book and really, really, really starting to understand the historical consciousness of the place. So I thank you very much for giving us new eyes with which we can start considering the past and hopefully also the future. And with that, I'll open up for questions from the floor.
Tariq, you said you ended the book at the point of partition. I know you're a historian, but I'm going to ask you to use your imagination and delve into almost historical fiction. So can you tell us, I mean, what happens to jute in this part of the world if partition doesn't happen? What happens if the Second World War hadn't happened? I mean, was the industry unnaturally stopped, or would it have died out anyway? What are your thoughts on that?
If partition hadn't happened, is the great what if question.
I'm not sure. I'm his friend.
He works for marketing. If partition hadn't happened, I think it's a great what if question. I think everything would be very, very, very different. I mean, Dhaka would not be Dhaka. We'd probably be in Calcutta right now, right? We might not even be here. Many of us would still be peasants right now. But I don't know. But what would have happened to jute? The jute industry did not die off because of partition. The jute industry died off because of alternatives that came up. And the jute industry, I think if you had to pick one reason why it died off, it was because of containerization. Once containers came in, sacks were no longer needed. You could just put things in containers, right? You didn't have to sack it in jute anymore. The other thing that killed off jute that isn't talked about, that I talk about briefly, is probably the green revolution in rice. If jute and rice was always competing, the green revolution in rice restored rice productivity, changed the cropping calendar quite radically, and really kind of took away the incentive to grow jute. The death of jute in Bangladesh is actually a story of the 80s, right? Containerization happens in the 60s and 70s, but jute dies in the 80s when the green revolution spreads. So I think there's an argument to be made there. It's not an argument that I make very forcefully in my book, because my research doesn't go over there. But my hunch is that jute was killed by various forms of competitors rising, but really also by the very economics of farming being changed by tube wells, by ED, by new cropping calendars and so forth.
Since my question is very brief, I shall start with a slightly longer introduction, which is to congratulate you on many counts. The first of which is that you write about a subject about which we seem to know a lot. Although I must say that listening to you, I was thinking that perhaps that day is not very far when I will have to take my children to the museum to tell them about jute. In Bashir Bhai's generation and in my generation, we knew about it. Patshala has disappeared, so also Patshola. This is what we used to play with, used as firework in thatched houses, and so many other things. Now, also it was very much a part of the narrative of the Bangladesh history, replete with our nationalist struggles, with the speeches of Bangabandhu. It became a symbol of the exploitation that Pakistan had done from the resources of jute. Leaving that aside, my very brief question would be, you mentioned that the jute production or the earning slumped during the First World War. That was a bit intriguing because we know that it received a boost during the 50s, the Korean War. You know, the jute boys, jute men who made it big were in the 50s when the jute production really went up. And that's the question to you. The second thing is that now there is this buzz thing about environment. A lot of things are coming out of jute. So looking into the future, and if we, your revered dad and I, can dare to look into the future, why not you? How do we resurrect? I mean, a lot of things are being done. This environment friendly, wisdom, biodegradable. So would we not expect your next sequel to the book to look about taking into the future and the prospects of jute? Third and the last comment. Yes, there was the nationalist movement. But it went to the extent that even Rabindranath was moved to writing his famous Ghare Baire, and in many of his articles, that this is leading to severe misunderstanding between the communities. Thank you very much once again.
No, but thank you. No, so World War I did lead to a boom in jute manufacturing. Jute sacks and the Calcutta jute industries production capacity expanded hugely. But what it led to was two things. One is right at the outbreak of World War I, when we didn't know what the manifestations would be, jute prices collapsed very sharply. From about 9 rupee something a mon the previous year to less, you couldn't sell jute for 1 rupee a mon. And because farmers had reached that point where they really needed to sell jute to buy rice, they were in very bad shape that year. And of course, as the Calcutta manufacturing industry consolidated, they became more cartel-like, and they started controlling prices much, much more strongly. So a lot of the high prices that manufactured goods were receiving did not translate to high prices for farmers, and in fact was prevented from translating to high prices for farmers by wartime economy measures. Um, the revival of jute. But I mean, do you really want to revive jute? I mean, it seems to me that in 1930, 1940, nationalists, Bengali nationalists were like, jute is what is holding us back. Abul Hashim, when partition was announced, and Abul Hashim, leader of the Muslim League, he gave a press conference when partition was voted on, and he said, the future of East Pakistan is very bleak. It seems to us we'll forever make jute, we'll be forced to sell it to Americans, and we'll buy cigarettes for them in exchange. So he saw jute as a way of colonial bondage. The nationalist movement, we also saw jute as a way of Pakistani bondage, right? Jute, we grow jute, Pakistan takes away the money. And lots of people saw jute as it's actually not good for us because we're not growing enough rice. We're growing jute and we're not feeding ourselves, and we're growing goods that make money for not even our own businessmen, which I'm not sure it makes it any better, but for businessmen elsewhere. So I think what always fascinates me is this idea that despite this long-running historical discourse about how jute has been a means of exploitation of the peasantry, we keep wanting to bring jute back. And I think that's kind of what my conclusion is really about. Why is it that we have this desire to bring jute back? And in the conclusion, I say that I give two kind of arguments. One is really about the Bangladesh movement. Because jute was so central to it, Bangladesh would finally fulfill the promise of jute. Jute profits would go to farmers and the nation and so forth. The second was, I think, part of our memory of jute is a critique of the garments industry. In the jute industry, we have this idea of large-scale capital, profits of indigenous commodity from the ground to the finished product, um, Adamji jute mills and so forth. We have long-term employment for laborers, certain ideas of labor welfare, labor housing. Then we look at the garments industry. It's very much neoliberal capitalism. It's just-in-time production. It's flexible supply chains. It's flexible labor supplies. And I think we remember jute in the ways we do because it's not the garments industry. That's what I say in my conclusion. I mean, do I look at the crystal ball and I think jute will come back? No, I don't. Jute was big because it was packaging. I think as a handicrafts commodity, it's limited. Jute, I mean, it's going to be limited use. And when it was packaging, it was mass use. It was staple. And as a handicrafts, it's just. I hope that answers your question. We don't know. I mean, crystal balls are difficult to look into.
Hi, congratulations on the book. My question as a non-historian is about your methods. Could you speak to your archives and where you got your data?
So, I mean, most of my research was split between, I mean, I guess I will talk about the archives first. The National Archives of Bangladesh, for those of you non-historians who are here, please go check it out. It's a really fun place. It's a party in there all the time. No, it's great. It's a great place. Some of it I was at the National Archives of India in Delhi, the British Library, the India Office Library. But let me tell you a little bit more about the kind of documents I used. So a big chunk of it was correspondence between different parts of the colonial state. correspondence from the Ministry of Commerce, the collector in Rajshahi writing to the Department of Agriculture secretary that, or, stuff like that. And from that, you get both, you get a lot of impressionistic evidence, right? Things like, today, the cultivator is notoriously improvident. He's frivolous to a great degree, etc., etc., etc. But then you also have the sort of the published colonial reports, which is the colonial state's great sort of statistic collecting machine. The internal trade reports looking at the movement of goods from Calcutta to different provinces in East Bengal was a big part of my sources. And third, of course, was the Bengali language published sources, which I got between the Dhaka University Library, National Library, Kolkata, and the Vernacular Tracts collection of the British Library. And you get really a very, very rich and very, very underused, I think, collection of pamphlets, poems, written and published in small towns throughout Bangladesh, which are there are hundreds, thousands of these such texts that I think can be used much, much more usefully than historians have thus far.
Very quick question. Congratulations, of course. I thought we had a brief conversation about this the other day. I thought your book was going to be in part about the emergence of a Bengali Muslim middle class. I see the subtitle and I realize, I'm wrong. So, although probably there is something in there, it sounds like, from what I've heard. I haven't read the book. But I'm wondering, since you are talking about capital, and I'm very interested in capital and culture, what the relationship between the peasant masculinities that you talked about and Bhadralok culture, I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that, if that makes sense. And just to throw out my second point, this is not a question, is it's very interesting what you say about the nostalgia over jute being about the garment industry, but it's also very interesting that many of the garment workers that I've spoken to, some of the prominent ones will present themselves as, they would say, the golden girls of Bengal, drawing precisely on this idea that there was a golden fiber. I think you're really onto something very interesting about why at particular moments, particular things become objects of nostalgia. But I think that's very much about, perhaps that's what I would think about jute too. The jute industry has welfare, had all of that. I wonder if there isn't a little bit of a very positive kind of displacement. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that's really interesting. I think that sounds like it, right? I mean, of course, the word golden gets used a lot, right? Golden rice, golden jute, Sonar Bangla. Um, but so peasant masculinity and Bhadralok cultures as sort of both as sort of contradict as something that were constructed in relation in opposition to each other, perhaps. Um, so I guess one of the things I think I argue throughout the book. So one of the ways in which we have traditionally understood the making of Muslim identity politics in Bengal is that this was formulated in contrast to the Hindus, right? So part of like what is argued by Pradip Dotto in Carving Blocks, for instance, is that Muslim peasant identity formulation was about excising the inner Hindu, about getting rid of Hindu practices, getting rid of Hindu. And there's always this notion of the Hindu that we must overcome. Nilesh Bose, I think, also argues that part of what Muslim literary identity comes about from attempting to gain acceptance from the Hindu as Bengali, this being a driving factor. I think what I am trying to say is that maybe we need to stop thinking about the Bhadralok Hindu as the counterpoint, but rather think of the market and the marketplace as a place where certain ethics, certain ideas of behavior, certain kinds of logics are formulated. So when I look at my agrarian Islamic texts, even when I see things which, when peasants have the Albert cut and they wear fancy clothes, of course they say they're doing babugiri. They shouldn't do babugiri, and you need to get rid of babugiri. So you can say from that there's something like this critique of babugiri is an attempt to critique of Bhadralok identity and so forth. But I think it is also about, the next line is, but your babugiri costs you a lot of money. You can like not do babugiri and like spend less money and have more money. So I think there's a way in which the market really kind of refracts or creates sort of these discourses in ways which we don't recognize when we get caught up in the Hindu-Muslim dichotomy, as a way in which sort of cultural forms emerge.
So we've got one more question and then we'll have to wrap up.
Can I ask you one?
Two more questions.
Okay. Sir, as a history graduate, it would be unfair not to ask you a question. So as I used to learn that if I want to do economic history, then I have some sort of procedure. But when I started your book reading just few days ago, I started in the mind that I want to do a economic history book, and I'm reading it. But finally, when I reach the end point, I don't find that it is absolutely economic history book. Sometimes it turns into political history, sometimes little bit social history. But I want to ask you a question: that is it economic history book or is it a political history? Because if you give a short brief of economic history, then you will give some notes about labor history. Of course, 1 or 2 pages, because you mentioned that R.C. Dotto don't give would give 2 pages about jute in his books, but if you do a political history, then you would go another way, because I think that it is a complex to read. It is very complex to read from economic history or either political history. So what is kind of history you are doing in this book? That's my question.
So the book was published as a series called Histories of Economic Life. And I think I like that. I like that title, Histories of Economic Life. I think I'm not interested in the categories of economic history, political history, social history, cultural history. But the question really is, what is material, intellectual life of a peasant who grows jute like? And I think to answer that question, I move between methodologies. I move between methods and approaches.
Mubarakul Islam, economic history was a part of my research interest, but we have few economic historians in Bangladesh. In that way, I am very pleased to see you coming up in this area. I welcome you. I congratulate you on your publications, and I look forward to many more publications like that in spirit. As far as your book is concerned, I'm a traditional historian. I agree with you on a lot of things, but unfortunately, I don't agree. Let us not go into that, because I am traditional one, you are a modern one. I would just say that I congratulate you and see you do many more works in the same line. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One final question. Okay, the gentleman in the red there, waving his arms.
Oh, thank you for the talk. Very wonderful talk. Actually, when you were referring to that Mamla Baji, I was alluding to that, an anecdotal moment when I actually encountered my first peasant modern moment, where, for example, there are some anecdotal evidences or anecdotal stories where the stories of grandmas, peasant grandmas, who had the desire for their grandchildren to be, or ambitions to be, the judge barrister. From that, I actually conjectured that the newly formed modern juridical canon, as opposed to the classical canon, classical textually infinitive canon of classics or classical metaphysics. So I was thinking that grandmother still, that grandmother still actually infers to that their trust in the modern textual finitude of juridical justice. They are actually referring back to the newly formed modern colonial imperial, but still the juridical justice, which is actually textually located and textually finitude. And again, coming to your object-oriented modernity, I was thinking about object-oriented modernity as you were actually colliding between materiality and modernity, the material discourse of modernity. I was thinking of that if we think about the object-oriented ontology of modernity, we could find out that we can actually reform or recollect a completely new canon, new discourse of modernity, which actually doesn't allude back to that canonical disjuncture from the classical canon, rather than a quantum leap of objects, quantum leap of finitude objects which are finitude, which are consumable, which could be consumed within the historical bounds. And so the finitude of objecthood, finitude of consumable properties of objects and relations and objectuality actually could begin a new discourse of modernity, which is actually different from the canonical discourse of canonical metaphysical modernity, which is a modern phenomenon. So I was thinking along that line. So, sorry, very quick question, so I couldn't actually elaborate. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you. Like, I think that's.
So I think on that note, we can see that there's many enthusiastic responses to the book, and shall the conversations continue, I would just like to welcome up Professor Mohammed Ibrahim to give the vote of thanks to our special guest. Of course, my apologies. Professor Imran Rahman will hand over a crest to Dr. Tariq Omar Ali.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful. I mean, we never had an audience like this before. It's a unique opportunity. Actually, it's a great moment to congratulate Dr. Tariq on this book. I was fascinated by the look and the subject matter, but I felt at the end a bit sad because he stopped at the time when I started, because somehow, as it was pointed out already, this boom in 50s, Jute boom and Korean War, that story didn't come. And I mention this because I 100% support and agree with Dr. Tariq that Jute, for many of us, it's just a nostalgia. Jute is not coming back. No, there's no reason, there's no dynamics of its coming back. But what is important in history is nostalgia, very much so. For example, I still remember 54, 55, Maulana Bhashani talking, everything going to Pakistan and our golden fiber and all that. And we are hearing this echo of that, just an echo, nothing more, nothing less. But to me, I remember in the 50s and 60s, very religiously listening to Radio Pakistan and the jute prices, Jat, B bottom white, cross bottom white, and the last word is Habi Jabi. Habi Jabi. And these are all Dundee words. It's not our word. Dundee comes from Scotland, Dundee words. And we grew up with that. And even today, village to me is the rotting jute. Just a smell takes me to my childhood. So jute is a big nostalgia, and thanks to Dr. Tariq that he took us there once again. Thank you very much. Thank you all.